Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to our presentation on residential treatment care. I will begin our presentation by talking about what residential treatment care is and why we believe it is needed in Australia. Next, Tracey will discuss how this model can be incorporated into the Australian mental health landscape. And finally, Ken will explore how this model can be adapted to meet the needs of Indigenous youth in Australia. My CAMS term last year taught me a lot about child and adolescent psychiatry. One of the things I learned was that a CAMS inpatient ward was not the appropriate environment for externalizing behavioral disorders like conduct disorder. We had a few kids get admitted who had conduct disorder, but their admissions were generally brief. These kids tended to be much more stoic, and if they did disclose suicidal thoughts while distressed or intoxicated, the stoic facade would quickly be back in place the next morning. As to be expected, their admissions were accentuated by their externalizing behaviors. They would get into fights and damage ward property. An inpatient CAMS ward is simply not the appropriate therapeutic environment for them. Good plans were made for community management, but there was also an acknowledgement that they would be unlikely to engage until this engagement became involuntary through juvenile justice. And so, as an inquisitive, young-ish registrar, I asked my supervisor if there were any facilities in Australia that were capable of managing externalizing behaviors. We have tertiary services in Sydney, like the Walker Unit for internalizing behaviors, like suicidal thoughts and deliberate self-harm. But for these units, not only are the externalizing behaviors not in their inclusion criteria, but they are often exclusion criteria. I was told that Sydney also has Coral Tree, and while their service does manage externalizing behaviors, their scope is very limited. The child must be under 12, admissions are limited to 4 nights only, and the child must have a family to return to or admissions are declined. And so, my supervisor challenged me to find out if such programs existed in Australia or anywhere else in the world for that matter. My research showed me that such facilities do exist, but not in Australia. This model of treatment is called residential treatment care, and I was excited to learn that my home country of Canada is one of the countries that makes wide use of such programs. This particular program takes children aged 10 to 18 with extreme behavioral difficulties for up to 90 days. This allows not just crisis management or assessment, but true rehabilitation by devising a plan. Most importantly, this plan can be implemented, monitored for problems, and have the plan modified in light of these problems, because a key feature of residential treatment care is that it occurs in a home-like environment. And yet, despite all of this occurring in a home-like environment, highly specialized staff are the ones providing care, including social workers, psychologists, and nurses. The most intensive of these facilities even have a psychiatrist as part of their multidisciplinary team. This is an example of one of the facilities that provides care intensively enough to require a psychiatrist. And yet, even though they're handling the most behaviorally disturbed children in the country, treatment occurs in what is essentially still a home. Because this is what we are getting these kids back to, and so this is where we need to see the management plan work. Some concessions are made to safety, the front and back doors are locked, the windows are reinforced, sharp objects are locked away. But it is still primarily a home. On a side note, that weird metal cage thing on the bottom right, that's a net for playing frisbee golf. By changing the environment, kids can be taught to engage in pro-social activities, like going for weekend bike rides, growing your own vegetables, like pumpkins for dinner, and going camping over school holidays. Part of my research was to ask, why doesn't this model exist in Australia? The Australian government's Australian Institute of Family Studies published an excellent issues paper on the topic. The paper identifies that residential treatment care is the level of intensity where you get a highly trained multidisciplinary team. Also, this model is not exclusive to children in out-of-home care, which means that you don't have to wait until the bridge between the child and their parents has been burnt. The bridge might be on fire, but it is still salvageable with intensive residential intervention, And this is incredibly important because it allows preemptive intervention that prevents the horrific attachment trauma that happens to a kid when their parents tell child services, "I can't do this anymore. You have to take them," which sets up the kid for a lifetime fear of abandonment and rejection. The paper acknowledges that residential treatment care does not exist and has largely been unexplored in Australia, citing that Australia does not have the same population and geographic density as countries like Canada to justify the funding of larger residential homes with higher levels of specialist staffing. But, as I'll discuss later, this issue will demand high levels of funding, either now by means of mental health intervention or later through paying for adult prisons. The paper also highlights that such models can be designed to accommodate juvenile offenders. Interestingly, Australia is beginning to adopt these residential models of care, as evidenced by the federal government spending $70 million of funding to establish residential treatment centers for eating disorders in 2019. I think what prompted me to present this topic was seeing senior clinicians in the field of adolescent and forensic psychiatry discuss how Australia was receiving international criticism for sending 10-year-olds off to prison, but that this law was up for review as the Council of Attorneys General of Australia were convening to discuss whether to raise the age of criminal responsibility. July came and went, and a decision was made to defer any changes to the minimum age of criminal responsibility, citing a lack of alternative options. Now, while I need to acknowledge that I have a ways to go in my training, given the acuity of the issue, I felt there was merit to asking the question, is residential treatment care the answer we are looking for? Could this model allow us to provide effective behavioral therapy for 10 to 13-year-old Australian children in a secure environment and thus allow us to stop sending them to prison? But, of course, we need to ask, does it actually work? I acknowledge that saying residential treatment care works by comparing adult incarceration rates is a gross oversimplification. But until someone gives me a pile of cash to do a PhD on the topic, I figured this was a good place to start. The most recent data available in both Australia and Canada was in 2018. In 2018, Australia's adult incarceration rate was 221 adults per 100,000. Canada's adult incarceration rate was 43% lower at only 127 per 100,000. Maybe this is because Canada is reluctant to incarcerate people. However, I would suggest the opposite. Growing up in Canada, I got the impression that Canadians were actually quite comfortable with sending their fellow citizens to jail when they committed a crime. And when you got out, you got a fresh start. And so, Canada is able to keep a low incarceration rate with, I would suggest, no substantial political pressure to keep this rate low, and they are able to do all of this with a higher minimum age of criminal responsibility. There isn't a lot of research on residential treatment care, but what research there is appears to be positive. Children do improve their psychosocial functioning, and in fact, the kids with antisocial behavior improve more than those with internalizing problems. All that said, the benefits are time limited if they don't receive ongoing support after discharge. So, how could we get this support here in Australia? Could we use the NDIS? I spoke with the National Disability Insurance Agency. They had never heard of a kid getting NDIS for conduct disorder. However, they did say that they could get it, and they have helped me put together a guide for how NDIS can be approved for kids with behavioral disorders. My email will be at the end of the presentation. Please contact me if you would like a copy of this guide. Getting back to the residential treatment care itself. Who's going to pay for it? Well, let's do some math. Australia pays a lot for each adult incarcerated, over 50% more than the OECD average. Combine that with a high incarceration rate, and we are paying $4.5 billion each year for the adult prison system. This is a big if, but if we could get our incarceration rate down to something similar to Canada's by investing in the treatment of childhood behavioral disorders over the next decade, this would save $1.9 billion every year. And I'm not suggesting we spend $1.9 billion on residential treatment care, But to give a sense of perspective, 1.9 billion would be enough to fund almost 300 10-bed residential treatment care units. And so we can see that investing in intensive, highly specialized care for kids with antisocial, externalizing behaviors is not cheap. It could potentially save a lot of money in the long run through reduced adult incarceration. Now, I would like to introduce one of our co-presenters, Tracey Lawson. Tracey is the Clinical Director for Chameleon Group, where she leads a team of therapists across Australia. Tracey is a board-certified behavior analyst and works with children and young people developing positive behavior interventions for NDIS clients.
Thanks, Kevin. It's really great to be here. So I just want to go through what does this all look like? And so basically we're looking at a live-in short-term model in regards to timeframes that will be individually assessed and determined by the initial treatment team. So we're looking at a multidisciplinary on-site team. So who's in that team? Psychiatry, cultural and family lead, a behavior analyst, occupational therapist, speech pathologist, a GP. So we really want to make sure that we capture the holistic needs of that young person. So in regards to the physical environment, we want to ensure that's pro-youth, culturally safe, which is definitely not my area of expertise, and we're looking forward to hearing from Ken shortly on that. But we want to separate the spaces of work and activities to emulate what would be occurring in a person's natural environment. We want artwork, music, soft furnishings that the young people can be akin to. So we want to ensure that the family and community are involved in this whole process. And so a critical element of the program is to have an on-site family residence. And as the young person goes through certain aspects of that initial programming and therapeutic support, then the family will come and live on site in a separate residence, but on site and accessible to the young person. And then they will themselves receive supports from the therapeutic team and the cultural and family lead to ensure that that whole process is co-designed and that we create some really clear pathways for success for the young person in regards to reunifying them with their family and community at the end of the program. So as we're determining the function of the behaviour and that multidisciplinary team are undertaking a really comprehensive holistic assessment of the person's challenges and skill areas and strengths, we're going to then put together a really individualised program for the person. That program will be developed from the result of the assessments. There'll be a case conference between the therapist, the family and community to really sit and have that co-design conversation about what's really important for this person. How do we ensure social validity and increased acceptability of the treatment by the young person themselves and their family? Without that acceptability of treatment, we're all kind of, throwing money in a hole. And so we want to really focus on that effectiveness of the program. We want to then ensure that there's measurable outcomes, and that's set from the outset for each member of that child therapy team. So each of us will all have our clear, definable, measurable goals that we all want to support each other achieve with that young person, so then they can reach their overall goals. Another key success factor of this model is that fluidity of the treatment intensity that will be congruent with the individual person's needs. And so basically how that looks like is that once we have those measurable outcomes and goals for that young person, as the person goes through the treatment program and certain goals are met, measured, we have data to show that progression through treatment, then the intensity of that treatment then decreases congruently with the as the person meets those goals. A transition plan begins upon program entry for that young person, and data is collected the entire way through, so we can actually measure and communicate what we're all doing and how we're achieving those goals for the young person. So why applied behavior analysis? Why not another approach? Basically, applied behavior analysis really replaced that old behavior modification programs as they used to just focus on changing the behavior without really clarifying the relevant environmental interactions that person has. So in contrast, ABA changes behavior by first assessing the functional relationship between the person themselves and their environment. So behavior modification focuses on changing a target behavior, altering a problematic behavior, but not really understanding the function, what's promoting and maintaining that behavior for the young person in their natural environment. ABA focuses on the relevant behavior and environmental interactions. It focuses on immediately decreasing serious behaviors of concern while simultaneously increasing the person's identified skill deficit areas. If a behavior is repeated, there's a function, there's a payoff for it. And there's a great little terminology that, behavior goes where reinforcement flows. A behavior is repeated because it's being reinforced. We really need to understand what that environment looks like, and to have any chance of interrupting those behaviors and having long-term efficacy for the program. ABA is all about data and measuring systematic interventions. And so the strength of ABA compared to some of the other methodologies is that it's science-based, it's data-driven, but it focuses on the person and their environment and what's important and socially valid to them. So when the person first comes on board, part of that assessment process is to do a functional analysis. And so we want to actually really gain an understanding of what the function of the behavior is, what's the payoff for the person, how is that being reinforced and maintained in that person's natural environment, and what do we do to try and interrupt and reduce those behaviors of concern that they're displaying. And so we would do a functional analysis to test our hypothesis of what that behavioral function is, and then we would measure behavior by those environmental determinants. So it sits much easier within a culturally appropriate model than some other behavior modification models. Another key consideration is regards to barriers. So what are the barriers for that young person to succeed through this program, in community, in general? What does that look like? So it's important to undertake a barriers assessment along with the data in regards to frequency and severity of those maladaptive behaviours within that pre-intervention phase. The key to success for this model is around collaborating partners, and that includes everyone in that person's life. And so the progress is discussed with the family as the young person progresses through the program, as well as the whole treatment team and cultural and community lead. So we're all sort of co-designing, collaborating every step of the way. When there's a barrier, an issue, or something that comes up as a challenge and something is not quite working, then it's back to that group of people to really get together and discuss openly what is going to work and what isn't going to work and why. Now, the great pleasure to introduce you all to Ken Zelamovsky. He received an honorary award of Doctor of Health Sciences by the University of Sydney for his pioneering work in Indigenous mental health. As founder and managing director of Gamarada Universal Indigenous Resources, Ken, welcome.
Thanks, Tracey, and thanks, Kevin, also for sharing your vision and your aspiration for Australia to join the many countries who are now starting to look at alternative progressive models in residential treatment as opposed to locking up our youth. As Tracey alluded to, I am going to share with you today some of the successes in our work, building resilience with culture. I'm going to particularly focus on the courage coaching model and a little bit about the Gamarada story and some Indigenous wisdom traditions I'm going to share with you as well. Yeah, isn't it great to see in 2021 the merging of Indigenous wisdom traditions with mainstream clinical practices? And right here we've got a fantastic example of Dr. Marsha Lenihan, founder of Dialectical Behavioural Therapy, with myself as an Aboriginal mental health worker and clinician, with Auntie Miriam Ungamer-Bowman, who brings to us the Dathity, the sort of equivalent to mindfulness. And there's a fantastic piece of news that's come about this year, January 26. She was awarded Senior Citizen of the Year or Elder of the Year, and that's certainly going to facilitate the bridge from First Nations, Indigenous-led mental health to the mainstream practices we're going to hear more about now. And what better an alternative model than to be aligning First Nations-led mental health with the mainstream clinical models. And right here we have a definition of the Dathity, which translates to quiet stillness, inner contemplation to inform action now and later, a listening with more than the ears, a deep calling to deep, as Auntie Miriam says. And you can see the similarities between dialectical behaviour therapy, which is founded on the Zen practice of mindfulness, and it's the practice of holding opposites together, and recognized as the gold standard for psychological treatment. In putting together this presentation, I thought it was time to maybe go back a little bit, 10 years or so, and revisit this concept of social and emotional well-being. It's incredibly important to the healing of First Nations Australians and also to the broader community. I mean, social and emotional well-being is an important term. It's used by our mob to go beyond the clinical aspects of health and disease, particularly related to mental health and young people's health and child health. The Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, Bringing Them Home National Inquiry, recommended that there would be more holistic concepts of treatment and care that would be better suited to our people, and it's applicable to the mainstream as well. So these themes of belonging and trust are interwoven through the design concepts of the residential treatment program, particularly the First Nations elements of it. We have empirical evidence of use in the First Nations customized DBT in schools. It indicates that skills training that's effective as a proactive approach for the whole of school cohort and in the Australian context. And the DBTs can be modified for Indigenous perspectives in the Didiri or the mindfulness. We in Gamarada have designed a program to meet the Australian professional standards in teaching that we feel is applicable across, and we've used it across the mental health landscape. Our program was designed to meet teaching standards. One, students and how they learn, which could be applied, or is applied to residents and how they learn. Classroom safety, again, residential safety, and standard 7, which is community engagement, all very applicable to the current system and the proposed system of residential treatment care. So the methodology is the reflective practice that ties into the Dathity, quiet stillness, listening with more than the ears, to encourage awareness and to encourage awareness of the ego or the shadow or whatever it is, our triggers, our traumas. The learning circle and the reflective journaling is incredibly integral to how the process of transformation works for the participants. The courage coaching model, as I might have mentioned already, is a result of a therapeutic alliance between mainstream and First Nations mental health practitioners. Courage stands for culture, optimism, understanding, relationships, acceptance, gratitude, and encouragement. Each one of those words is a workshop in itself, and that was designed with elements of military leadership as well from my time in the army. And that again creates a culturally safe framework for program co-design, for cultural supervision of staff and emerging leaders, and the ability through compassion-focused peer support, increasing compassion-focused therapy is also incredibly integral to this as well, because as we know, there's multiple traumas involved here. Very, very delicate situations and potential for blow-ups and people to activate. So the compassion focus is extremely important in this setting. Okay, now many of you might have heard of the third wave therapeutic approaches. Excuse me. So in this model, we incorporate ACT skills, DBT skills, and the DAT-30 skills with the Gamarada courage coaching model. So ACT skills, identifying values and value direction. The pro-social question there is, what do you value? What are you prepared to do about it? We're linking changed awareness there with changed action. The DBT skills are wonderful. We know that they work really well for crisis. It's about distress tolerance. Many of our people are struggling with major stress and need skills to be able to get through those moments. And the acceptance and change about holding opposites together is really important, and that brings in the interpersonal effectiveness, getting your needs met, being able to ask for your needs, and getting them met without burning bridges and ruining relationships at the same time. And the emotional regulation is the fourth pillar of the DBT in our skills coaching. And the DDIRI, again, it's grounding yourself in culture, grounding yourself in respect, and grounding yourself in cultural values around responsibility and reciprocity. So there we have DBT stages of treatment. We have the house of treatment, a kind of illustration to show where it begins. Stage 1, severe behavioural discontrol. And we're seeing that getting control, it's like the house on fire, it's in crisis. And then we move up to stage 2, where we have quiet desperation. So there's exposure, PTSD work, the cognitive restructuring, there's the working to reduce suffering, and experiencing emotion, helping people sit with discomfort rather than act out, be impulsive, go to their vice, go to their addiction, go to their default behavior. Really important there, part of the treatment recovery process. And stage 3 is problems in living. So identifying and working towards life goals and increasing self-respect, experiencing ordinary happiness in everyday life, and unhappiness as part of everyday life too, without it having to go to crisis. And stage 5 is the incompleteness, capacity for sustained joy, bit of a spiritual awakening, or maybe a rite of passage for our mobs. There is a really sad common belief at the moment among some communities that going to prison is the rite of passage, and we're suggesting that rite of passage might be a recovery from our trauma, and a collective recovery where we have reconnection, reconstruction, and restoration, instead of a kind of a idea that incarceration is some kind of rite of passage. And you see the emergence of First Nations-led mental health and the DBT stages of treatment there. Some references there if you're interested. Check out the work of Stephen Hayes, Dr. Marsha Lenehan, Auntie Miriam Rose, Ungamere Bowman, winner of the Australian of the Year, or Elder of the Year, Australian Senior of the Year, and some work by Professor Auntie Judy Atkinson in healing generational trauma in Aboriginal communities. Some fantastic references there. I encourage you to check that out.